So I don't have to tell you what Star Wars The Clone Wars is, right? The show has been praised for its well-developed characters, its expansions to the Star Wars lore, and especially its dark tone. Like, despite the fact that The Clone Wars was originally a Cartoon Network show, some fans still refuse to acknowledge the idea of it being a kid show. That's not necessarily something that I agree with, but whatever. Anyway, in the final season of The Clone Wars, the audience was introduced to the Bad Batch, which are essentially just clone troopers with special enhancements that do not fit in with regular clones. And when the Bad Batch was introduced, I thought they were awful characters. Awful in the sense that they are one note and two-dimensional, which I'll talk about that a bit later. So when I initially heard that Disney was gonna make an entire show about them, I thought that would be a terrible idea. And now that I've seen the show, I must say, my opinion has not really changed for the most part. Also, as I'm speaking right now, I'm aware that the show hasn't been finished, but I want to talk about the show right now as opposed to later, because this video is based on my thoughts right now. Oh yeah, and before I start talking about why the series is so bad, I'm just gonna say that this is all my opinion, so if you like the Bad Batch, that is completely fine. I am only speaking for myself here. And I know for a fact that a lot of people like Bad Batch because it currently has an 8.4 rating on IMDb. And one last thing, this review is not spoiler free. So if you don't want spoilers, click away right now. Alright, now I can start complaining. As I said before, the Bad Batch members were terrible characters in their debut, and I still think they're terrible now. So I'm gonna start with talking about Wrecker. He is strong, he's dumb, he's a bit arrogant sometimes. That's pretty much his entire character. And it's the strong but dumb trope that gets me mad. It's been used hundreds of times by hundreds of different characters. Like, I've seen a lot of people compare him to Heavy from TF2, and yeah, that comparison makes sense to me. But with something like TF2, the characters aren't supposed to be compelling, and they're not supposed to have layers to them. They're supposed to be funny. Meanwhile, good characters are kind of essential to Star Wars, because Star Wars has always been driven by the actions of the characters. Like, so many people hate the sequel trilogy because of the protagonist Rey, because she's so good at everything. Alternatively, so many people like Luke Skywalker because despite the fact that he's good at stuff, he actually still screws up. I mean, him getting his hand cut off is proof of that. And yeah, Wrecker is a comic relief character, and comic reliefs aren't supposed to be compelling. They're supposed to be funny. And I can't really say that Wrecker's humor is bad because I only laugh at stuff that is completely random, but comic relief characters only work if they're surrounded by more compelling and layered characters, and honestly, the rest of the Bad Batch isn't much better than Wrecker. And yeah, I guess you can excuse Wrecker's cliche stupidity as being a side effect of his mutation, but honestly, I do not care. He is still a two-dimensional archetype. Do better, Disney. Tech is also an awful character. There is this one scene in a show called Doom Patrol where these astronaut guys list off a couple of characteristics about themselves in a very satirical way, making fun of shows and movies that lazily introduce their characters through narration. Doom Patrol is a very underrated show, by the way. You should watch it. It has Brendan Fraser as a cursing robot. But anyway, one of the astronauts says that his name is Specs and that he is the brains of the operation. And that's essentially Tech's entire character. I'm actually kinda having trouble talking about him because I don't know what to say aside from he's the smart guy. He mostly just exists on the show to do calculations and to serve the plot, and that's essentially it. And there's a million other shows that feature characters that are the smart ones as well. And I guess that you could say in the comments that there is nothing wrong with archetypes. And that's true, there is nothing wrong with archetypes in my opinion. But Tech is an awful character because there's nothing outside of him aside from being the smart one. Characters that use archetypes do not become interesting until you give them something that is outside of that archetype. Like, a lot of people say that Ezra Bridger from Star Wars Rebels is a bad character because he is kinda arrogant in the first 2 seasons, but at least I could still say that Ezra Bridger is, you know, an actual friggin' character and not a bunch of cliche traits that have been used in a million other shows. For all the annoying stuff that he does, Ezra is a god tier character in terms of writing when he's compared to Tech, Wrecker, and almost everyone else in Bad Batch. And then we get to Crosshair, who is probably the most dynamic member of the Bad Batch, but that's not really saying much. See, all the clone troopers in Star Wars have these inhibitor chips put into their brains, so when Palpatine says, "Execute Order 66, they are forced to obey his command and take out the Jedi. With the other members of the Bad Batch, these mind control chips were disabled due to their mutations, but Crosshair's chip forced him to obey the commands of the newly formed Empire." Yeah, I don't really understand it either, you just gotta roll with it. Now, there's this one scene in the Clone Wars where this one clone executes a Jedi while repeating the phrase, "Good soldiers follow orders." And I bring this up because that's essentially Crosshair's entire character. Crosshair says the same phrase, by the way. He cannot think for himself, he's just a blank slate that serves others around him, and yet he's also supposed to be one of the main antagonists of the series. All the other clones are also blank slates because of their inhibitor chips, you know, all the clones besides the Bad Batch, but there is still focus given to Crosshair, a character with no character. I guess that he's supposed to be kinda tragic because of this, but like I said, we already got mind-wash clones in the Clone Wars. Like, after Ahsoka removes Rex's inhibitor chip, they honor the clones that tried to execute them because those clones had no control. Crosshair was a member of the Bad Batch, but now he serves the Empire. I think I said this before. It would have been interesting if Crosshair also had a disabled chip, but he chooses to stick with the Empire because the Empire maintains order throughout the galaxy. That was one of their purposes. However, the other members of the Bad Batch are hated by our antagonist, Grand Moff Tarkin, for dealing with problems in an unconventional manner that can be seen as somewhat chaotic. Now, the theme of order and chaos has been used in a lot of media, but usually it's the protagonist that is order and the antagonist that is chaos. If Crosshair had a friggin' character, then we could have seen an inverse of this trope. Instead, we have a blank slate that doesn't even make decisions. Also, I hate Crosshair's voice. D. Bradley Baker voices every single clone trooper in the show, and he usually does an okay job. I say an okay job instead of a good job because Baker gives all the clones Australian accents, even though the original clone actor was from New Zealand. However, Baker gives Crosshair a very rough sounding voice. It's like he's trying too hard to be edgy, but it just comes off as really cringeworthy. And I guess Baker has a reason for doing this voice because Crosshair was kinda edgy, you know, before his inhibitor chip was activated, but he's not really edgy anymore. Like I said, Crosshair is a blank slate now, and now I get to talk about Hunter, the leader of the batch, and also one of the blandest protagonists I have ever seen in a show. Like, that's pretty much his entire character. He's the leader of the batch. Like, I'm having a hard time describing him because he's so generic. He supports his teammates and he gives them orders. I guess you could say, oh, but he looks after that kid Omega. And you'd be right, but that still falls under him supporting his teammates. I mean, Omega appears in every episode of the show. She might as well be a member of the Bad Batch now. And all of the members of the Bad Batch look after the kid. It's not just Hunter. The only time where Hunter breaks that character mold of not just being a leader guy is when he sells Echo, easily the best member of this awful team, to some random guy just to get money. But even then, Echo was only being sold temporarily temporarily. Echo is still able to rejoin his team, and the scheme was just a way to get money. And I know that Hunter isn't actually gonna sell Echo because that doesn't align with his character. There's no interesting conflict here. And that's not even mentioning how the guy who briefly owns Echo becomes irrelevant after this because he doesn't appear in the rest of the episode after Echo leaves him, so it's not like it's an interesting moral dilemma either. So yeah, Hunter really is just the leader guy trope. Like, I really just don't know much about Hunter besides the fact that he's the leader guy, he looks after the kid, and he has hypersenses, which is just such a surface level observation because a character doesn't suddenly become interesting just because he has powers. It's like Disney threw a kid at leader guy and said to the audience, you're supposed to care about him now, and he's not even a good father either. In one episode, the kid Omega wanders off and she's almost captured by a bounty hunter. And after she wanders off, she learns how to use weaponry, so it's not like Hunter even gets a father arc. And now we get to talk about Omega. As soon as the character was introduced, I didn't like her. Apparently she's a clone, despite the fact that she's female. She felt like she was there just because apparently every franchise with a masculine audience needs to have a female that's the main character. Like, seriously, name a franchise with a masculine audience in the comments, and I can probably think of a main character that's female. But what I really hate about Omega is that she's just another archetype. She starts out as a good-hearted, wide-eyed child that's fascinated by the world around her. She's excited to touch dirt. She wanders off from the Bad Batch when she sees something that she likes. She's an archetype, just like the rest of them. Well, at least she was an archetype in the beginning of the show. Omega isn't actually too bad. Like, I still hate her, but she's not too bad because this character does actually receive development. Like, learning how to use a laser bow is not like great character development by any means, but that's still much better than the rest of the Bad Batch. So yeah, that's how bad I think the show is. Now, these characters get themselves into dire situations constantly, but because they're so uninteresting, I just don't care. For example, in one episode, Wrecker's inhibitor chip is activated while Rex is trying to disable it, so the Bad Batch's lives are now in danger because this one strong guy is against them. But I couldn't care less, because I don't care if leader guy and smart guy are put in danger, because they're so friggin' uninteresting. Oh yeah, and there are some other complaints I have about the show as well. For example, in one episode, the Batch goes into a factory and almost no character development or character work happens. Now, this episode isn't filler because it reintroduces characters from the Clone Wars into the Bad Batch because Bad Batch is riddled with fan service, and towards the end of the episode, those characters contact Captain Rex, who has a big role in the next episode. But apart from that, there really isn't much character work here. You know, besides Wrecker hitting his head and saying, good soldiers follow orders, even though we've already seen Wrecker hit his head before, and Omega being put into danger, which, again, we've seen this before. Instead, this episode feels like just one big action set piece, because most of the episode is action-oriented. Now, there is nothing wrong with action. My problem is that with a show like Bad Batch, I'm supposed to be invested in the characters, but with this episode, a good story isn't really the focal point. And there are some other episodes like this as well. For example, there's this one episode where most of runtime is dedicated to the Bad Batch fighting a Rancor. The show obviously wants me to care about these characters, but it doesn't really seem to care much about writing these characters to actually be care-worthy. And sure, these episodes that I'm describing push the plot along, but an episode of a show shouldn't just serve the purpose of pushing the plot along. It should also be interesting in its own right. Oh yeah, and Bad Batch is riddled with fan service. There are a lot of examples of fan service in the show, but the worst piece of fan service is definitely Kanan from Star Wars Rebels showing up in the first episode. Kanan is almost captured by Imperial forces, but he escapes capture and doesn't show up for the rest of the show. So his cameo is pretty pretty pointless. And plus, Star Wars Rebels was a show aimed towards kids because of its TVY7 rating, so a lot of fans probably skipped over it, and therefore they don't know who this is. Like, in Rebels, Kanan says that his master was taken out by clones, like every other Jedi, so what was the point of putting Kanan here? So, is there anything that I actually like about the show? Well, yeah, actually. In the show, we see that Grand Moff Tarkin believes that he no longer needs the Kaminoans, aka the species that created the clones. He believes that he can find much better units with regular people, and this makes the Kaminoans feel threatened because they have kind of lost their purpose for the Empire. Alright, but is there anything else that I liked? Well, I liked the introduction of this one alien character that allied with the Bad Batch named Sid, but that was mostly because she called the Bad Batch stupid, so I immediately felt for her, and to be fair, I think she has a funny presence throughout the rest of the show. But sometimes she comes off as condescending for no good reason. Like, as much as I don't care for Omega, I don't think that she should be talked down to by a full-grown adult. It just makes Sid look really immature. What else? What else did I like about the show? Cad Bane is in the show, and he captures Omega, so that's cool. But in the case of Cad Bane, that's not really something that the show does right itself. For Cad Bane is a character from the Clone Wars, so they are just reusing a character from another show. But honestly, at this point, I don't really care, because the show does so much wrong, so it's nice when it actually does something right. The more I think about Bad Batch, the more I hate it. I want to like Bad Batch, I really do. And if I just turned off my brain, I probably would have liked seeing Wrecker shoot at stuff, but as it stands, the show is kind of a big disappointment.